Welcome to Art Appreciation Chapter 5. We are talking today about the principles of design. So I want you to think of it like this. If the elements of art that we spent quite a long time talking about last time, if those are the building blocks, the things that you need, the elements, the tools that you need, but think of them as building blocks, then the principles of design is like the building, how you're building the thing, or even the directions to how to build the building. Another way to think of it is if you have ingredients, like when you're making a recipe, the ingredients would be the elements of art, and the principles of design are the instructions, the actual recipe. And the finished work of art is the finished baked good or recipe food item that you've been making. So hopefully that kind of puts it in mental order for you. Ingredients and the recipe is like our metaphor for understanding the elements of art and the principles of design. So let's jump into what they are. There's a few key terms here. Actually, all of the key terms here are the actual principles of design, except for the first one says composition. So we'll go through these one at a time and break them down, show you examples as we always do, from famous works of art, not so famous works of art, just anything we can kind of pull up to visually show you how these principles are working. So let me just read through the list. We have composition, which is not a principle of design. The rest of them are. We have unity, and another way a lot of artists, art books, people talking about and describing art will also use the word harmony. We have variety. Another way to say that is contrast. We have balance, emphasis, scale, and proportion, which are very different things, but yet they're kind of related to size, and so we lump them together for the purposes of this course. We have rhythm, which is created through repetition, and we'll talk more about that when we get to it. And we also have movement. Now, side disclosure, I find that the principles of design get kind of changed more frequently than the elements of design. There's always the main ones. You always have balance and emphasis and rhythm. Usually either unity or harmony is very common. But some textbooks, some art experts will use a different combination of these. They don't always use the exact same ones. That's why I gave you a couple different words to represent what unity is. And then sometimes, like movement is actually not in this particular text that we're using, isn't even included, which I think it's important to include it because it is a very common one. When you're talking about principles of design, that's usually one that is included. So it's kind of strange that this particular book that I use for the course doesn't include it, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it today so that you're aware of that one as a principle. Just know that these come and go. They fluctuate depending on who you're talking to, what the course is, what the art class is. So you have to be a little bit flexible with these. And then I have an asterisk down there because pattern is sometimes considered an element and sometimes considered a principle. And I did not include it on this list because we talked about pattern as an element of art. So as you think about it, you might, when I get to rhythm and repetition, pattern kind of fits into that discussion as well. I will try to explain how pattern can be used as an element, and it can also be used as a principle of design. So again, there's a little bit of gray area, but for the most part, these are them, and hopefully you'll be able to get a mental grasp on what these are as you see them. So the first definition is composition. You want to make sure you write all definitions down today. Jot down the artworks I show you, and maybe even a brief, if you can, write down in your notes how they show the principle that I'm just using it to describe. So composition is the organization of all the visual elements within a work of art. Artists create using guidelines known as the principles of design. Typically, you might put a little line out of composition in your notes and say, composition is often what we think of with two-dimensional works of art. How, and I've said this many times as we've gone through, how the things are arranged on the piece of paper. The picture plane or the rectangle you're working on, whether it's a canvas or a piece of paper or lithography or whatever type of material you're using, that flat surface is the space you have to work in. And the shapes or the colors or the lines or the textures, how you arrange those and organize them, that's the composition. But when you're talking about a three-dimensional work of art, even like a building, architecture, or a sculpture that's three-dimensional, composition doesn't work as well because we're not within usually a specific space. We're taking up space, but we're not like on a flat piece. So you can think of a more broad word is just design. So if you want to, I didn't write it separate here, but you might just want to write the word design and put some stars and squiggles around it to show you that that is really the organization of the elements. When artists take the organization of the elements and choose what they're going to do with them, they are designing. So I hope that makes sense. Composition is one of those words that gets used on everything, how it's organized. But like I said, it just fits better with 2D. Design fits better with everything, 2D, 3D. And then the principles of design are just these guidelines that we use. So we're going to jump right in and begin with our first principle today, which is unity. Unity, often also called harmony, oftentimes in the art world, is, you can probably think of what those words mean to you, and you're probably about right. It's the sense of oneness, of things belonging together, making up a coherent whole. Another synonym or definition word for harmony could possibly be peace or related. And you can jot those words down too if you wanted to. Anything that kind of helps you get the idea of what this is saying. Now, it's not between people. It's not unity to be between people or unity or harmony in a household. It's unity within a work of art. And so this is visual unity. Get that thinking right now as we go through each of these. It's all about what you see visually. So when I show you the next few works of art, see if you can see that sense of oneness, things belonging together, making up a coherent whole, peace among the work, a unified feeling. It just goes together. The things in the artwork go together. A couple of side definitions on the next slide. Still under this principle of unity. We have visual unity and we have conceptual unity. You know, visual always means eyes. So it's when your eyes are seeing the thing and you see unity between elements, then you're seeing the principle of design unity being used. And then, so that's totally visual. Conceptual, on the other hand, is created through tying a group of ideas together. This is a mental thing. This is concepts. And they're being tied together through whatever means the artist chooses to do. They can do that through the use of those elements again, though. So when you look at the work of art, you're like, okay, I'm not really visually seeing what it's doing, but when I think about it and I look at what that part says or what that part looks like and what that means and then how it relates to this other thing over here and what it means, then you start to get a sense of conceptual unity. So we'll look at some examples now. Okay, this is Hassam's A Northeast Headland, 1901. And this one, I'm just going to let you look at it for a second. I give you the answer at the bottom where it says it's an example of visual unity. But as we start to look at these and analyze artworks today, like we're real art critics right now. We are really visually analyzing what we see. Based on your knowledge of what we studied last time, the elements of art, can you see some of those elements being used in a way that creates visual unity? Because remember, the elements are the tools. They are the ingredients that then get put together in a work of art using those guidelines of the principles. So let me just describe how you might be looking at this thinking, no, I don't see what you're talking about, which is okay. We're just getting started in this. I want you to try really hard to grasp the process that you have to go through to be able to do this. So I'll talk us through this one. So when I look at this, I see a lot of texture. I see the roughness of the stones on the beach, laying on the shoreline there. Lots of roughness and texture there. The stones and the jagged wood, little tufts of grass here and there. Okay, so that's texture. I see a lot of color changes. I see reds and yellows. I see tans and browns. I do see, and those are all warm colors that I just talked about. Those are all like related to the reds, oranges, and yellows family. Then I also see large masses, large spaces of blue and green, which is the water and the sky. And I see some patches of green for the little trees and things up on the top of the cliff there. Okay. I see, what other elements do you notice? I see a deep sense of space. Like the things in the front are right up close to us, and then they go way back in the back towards, as they move up the piece of paper, you see that going back in space, like we talked about last time. With line, I see a very strong horizontal line back in the distance. Can everybody see where the sky meets the water? Right here. So that's a strong horizontal, which is a calming feeling. But over in this area, I get a lot more choppiness and kind of just, like I said, texture. However, when I look at the water, I am seeing lots of texture in the water too. Do you see all these little brush strokes and little places where the watercolor changes and there's little white caps? So there's some texture there. And then even in the sky, I notice it's pretty solid, but there's a lot of texture in the sky as well. Little brush strokes, little variations in the colors and shades of green. So as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking texture keeps coming up in my head. And it feels like the way the artist has painted this with lots of texture, and it's not actual texture, it's implied texture from last time's lecture we talked about. If you felt this with your hand, you're not going to feel the roughness of those rocks, are you? It's going to feel like a flat painting. But the artist has painted it in a way that makes it feel like it has bumps, like the rocks would be, the roughness of that. So those are implied textures. So in my mind, the texture of this painting, the element of texture, is sort of treated similarly throughout. Even in places that are smoother, like back here in the sky, there's still the application of texture. And the majority of the painting has this very rough, definite texture. So in my mind, texture creates unity throughout this painting. The whole thing feels like it goes together because the artist has painted it in a similar way, in a similar style. There's another word we talked about previously. Sometimes the artist's style is just to paint kind of loose and rough and textury with lots of brush strokes. So that's how I would see unity. Now you may be looking at this and think, well, I see unity through the use of color. I feel like overall the whole thing has very similar colors throughout. Aside from maybe this blue area, everything has lots of neutrally colors and then some green patches here and there. And so maybe that's what you're feeling, like the whole thing is unified by similar colors, a color scheme, like we learned last time. You could analyze it thinking of line. Is there unity or a similarity throughout the whole thing by the way the artist uses line? What are the other elements of art? Space, space kind of, it goes back in space, but I'm not sure that that's a great way to unify this one. So anyway, that's a way you can analyze something and really hone in on which of those building blocks the artist focused on or you see being used that creates the principle of design. And in this case, the principle of design is unity we were looking for. Remember, it's how the whole thing feels like it goes together. Maybe if this water were painted very smoothly, without any texture, without any wave caps or variation in color, just like a real flat color of blue, maybe it wouldn't feel as unified, because then that is treated very differently than the rest of the painting, and so maybe it would start to feel kind of weird, like it's not as unified, which would be perfectly fine. That's up to the artist if they want to do that. But this artist was trying to create a unified scene. You could also say the artist created unity through color. One more way that just I thought of. I hope you can see it on your screen, but this color of blue, the paint that they used right here for this blue in the water, has been reflected up here into the rocky ground. The same color. I'm certain the artist just used the exact same color he used here, and purposely put little dots and dashes of it here, or even better yet, he may have painted the whole canvas blue first and then went in and added the land on top of that blue. And so these little spots through here, I don't know if you can see it, but like here there's some blue, here there's some blue, definitely down here, here. That might just be the blue paint that's underneath kind of showing through. There's some blue here. And then we see the same thing with the green, this greenish color for the sky, this greenish color on the hill over here. We see that popped in throughout. So that's another way artists can unify a whole painting, by using colors everywhere a little bit. So the blue is not just out in the water, but it's actually been speckled into the shoreline. And that unifies it. Then it helps it feel like it's going together because it even has colors in common. Whether land or sea, it's got colors in common. Okay, so that was kind of a long description, but I hope you're starting to see how you can visually analyze something to find what are those elements, the ones we talked about. Just find them. And then think about what they're doing and what is that creating? Is it creating a sense of unity? Maybe so. That's visual unity. This is an example of conceptual unity. So this one is, what you're looking at are like little picture frames hanging in an art gallery against the wall. Looks like by binder's twine or something like that. And they're all just kind of hanging there dangling. At first when you look at this, you might, and you're trying to think of unity, you could pick out some visual unity. Is there anything that's visually unifying this together when you look at it? Think of your elements of art. Shape, color, texture, line, time and motion, value. I'm sure I'm missing some off the top of my head. But if you think about those and just look for where those are happening, you might see some visual unity. When I said that, I thought to myself, oh, well, I see rectangular picture frames. Those rectangles, the shape of a rectangle is used throughout the whole work, and that unifies it through the use of shape. So that is a visual thing. But this could be also an example of conceptual unity. That means more like, what's it mean? What do you have to think about when you look at it? And since you can't really read those things or see it very good, I'm just going to tell you what you're looking at. You are looking at a photograph of different body parts. There's a hand and a neck and an ear and a knee and a leg and all the different, a head at the top. And they are arranged kind of in order of what they are, where they fall on your body, kind of. And every little writing is like a little description of how the artist feels about those different body parts, like what the head means to this artist, or what the what it represents to them, like being the top of the tower is your head. It's where all the brain comes from, right? The thinking and everything that you know. What about the ear? Like, what do you hear? What have you listened to in your life? So tying the idea of a body to life and what it means to you personally. Maybe when you talk about your hands, like, what have your hands done in your lifetime? What have they worked at? What have you learned to do, like a skill with your hands? Think of all the writing and typing and handshaking and just the things that our hands have to be able to do to feed us. And so just kind of thinking like that. See how I'm getting off in like thoughts and conceptual things? So this is like a unifying of the body through images and writings, just stopping to analyze what these different body parts do for us. So anyway, that's an example of more thinking about the unifying thing about this work of art. And you can't hardly get around the visual side, can you? Because it does clearly have some visual unity, but conceptually as well. Okay, this one I'd like you to look at for just a second. And think to yourself, how are you seeing visual unity in this one? You don't really know what it's about, so you can't go too much into conceptual unity probably, unless you imagine. You could just suppose what the artist conceptually is saying with this and see if there's unity there. But let's just do visually, looking at the elements of art: color, shape, line, texture, time and motion, value. Did I say line? Thinking about shape and mass. Those are the ones I always forget to say. Do you see some of those elements being used to create visual unity? Long, awkward pause. I wanted, if you wanted to, just to shout things out in your class or discuss among yourselves if that is conducive to your class. But what can you say about the color? You could say, if you didn't, the same colors are used throughout, right? So there's a unifying factor. What about the texture? The same texture essentially is used throughout. Now it varies, doesn't it? There's little bitty dots, and then there's bigger spaced out dots, and there's closer together ones where they look like they're forming a line. But in general, the thing is made up of little curved lines or dotted lines throughout the whole thing, spaced differently, but that's the idea. So that unifies it because the whole thing looks the same generally. It just goes together. So this one is very unified in color, texture, line, even space. It's very much yes, there's some parts where it's darker and maybe that feels like it's a little bit of a deeper place in what we're looking at. Where some of the lighter areas maybe look like a shallower place. I start to think of water almost when I look at this. So space kind of unifies it too, because it all feels generally the same. So that's how you can think about the elements again when you're trying to search for unity or think about, is this artist using unity? All right, kind of the flip side of unity is contrast, or I should say variety. They mean generally the same thing in the art world. Variety or contrast Those are differences that provide interest and contrast. So variety shows differences, and in those differences, the artwork then has interest and contrast. Our first example is this work of art by Henri Matisse, and I'd like you to look at it and see, how can you see variety in this work? So again, variety means using differences. Where can you find differences? So you have to compare when you're looking for this. Again, you might even make a list in your notes of the elements as we go through this, so you can keep checking yourself and asking yourself questions. You have color, line, shape, form, space, value, and texture. And then you also have time and motion, which is what we talked about at the very end of the last lecture. In what ways can you see variety or differences? Let's analyze color first. How do you see differences in color? You could start by thinking, well, there's definitely warm and cool variety. I see cool colors like greens and blues, but I also see warm colors like orange and red and yellow. And so would you say there's about the same amount of those warm and cool colors? Maybe about the same cool as there is warm? Maybe in general? I would say yes. However, for me, when I'm looking at it, you may see something different. However, the background, this negative, there's a word from last time, this negative space, almost reads to me like a warm color because it's sort of a tannish background. So that makes the whole thing feel warmer to me. Like the cool colors are a little outnumbered. What other things can we look at to see if there's variety? So with color, if you're using warms and cools, and even if you're just thinking, well, there's a variety of colors, right? It's not all just green and orange. There's also blue and yellow and red and some black. So they used a variety of colors, a variety of types of colors, like warm and cool. But then we could look at another element. What about shape? What do we know about shapes? Shapes, the main two divisions of shapes, which are two-dimensional flat things, right? We said shapes are flat, forms or mass is fat. Shapes can be geometric or they can be organic. I'm seeing this as pretty geometric. That's what I would call a rectangle. This green one, I would call that a rectangle. Another rectangle, another rectangle, another rectangle, long skinny rectangle. So some of them are very rectangular, which means geometric and man-made looking, where others, like this one, are very organic and irregular looking. They almost look like splattered paint instead of a shape you could name. So there's a variety of types of shapes, right? Do you see that? What about space? You could look at how the picture takes up space. How the parts of this picture. So then we're talking about composition. What is positive and what is negative? Kind of an interesting question. You have these shapes here that are colorful. They probably to most people would read as being the positive, the thing that the artist was drawing or focusing on. And then that kind of white, dull background would be, most people would probably read that as the background or the ground. So you have, remember, you have figure, ground, and you have positive and negative. Is there variety in that? there variety between the figure ground, the way the artist used the space to create figure and ground? I would say yes, because some of it's ground and some of it's figure. And there's not much in the ground, is there? It's pretty boring. There's some lines drawn, but it's mostly just that flat color, where the shapes have some almost textury looking colored in or brush strokes or something. So there can be some variety there. Background's solid and blank, other than some lines. The figure, the positive space, is colorful, has some texture. And this is just my analysis of it. You guys might be seeing something different, and that's okay. Also, you can talk about space this way. Look at how things are there's like more stuff over here. Do you see that? Littler and more things. A little more clumped together. This feels a little bit more spaced out. Not quite as tight. So that creates variety. One part of the painting feels more clustery and busy, where the other side feels more spaced out and not as busy. There's variety in space. So that's, and then lastly, is there some unity? We've talked about all the differences. We're trying to find differences in each of those elements. But what about unity? Remember, unity is what we just talked about. Does it all feel like it goes together? Does it have a sense of belonging together and oneness? No wrong or right answer. You could say, because the shapes are all so different, there's not too much unity. They feel disjointed. They don't feel like they go together. Or maybe you say, well, using multiple rectangles kind of unifies it, because that's a similarity that you can find in the shapes. Or maybe you could say what we talked about in the previous painting of the seascape. Because the artist purposefully used blue here and there and everywhere throughout the painting, then that use of that common color through the whole thing helps it all feel like it's going together. Can you see that at all? I think that would be a definite way to find unity in something like this. When that same color is sort of woven throughout the whole painting, then you feel a little bit of unity. Like, oh yeah, even though this corner's way over here all by himself with nothing else, he's blue, so it makes him relate to this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. So that creates a little bit of it going together. Okay, hopefully you're getting a sense for that a little bit of how to visually see these things happening. That was the topic of variety and unity. Let me just say again, every time I say unity, I'm going to try to say unity, harmony. Same basically thing. Every time I say variety, I'm going to try to say contrast. And hopefully the word contrast really makes your brain trigger differences. When you're looking for variety, when you're looking for contrast, differences is what you're really trying to find. Dig around and find some differences. Okay, our next principle of design is balance. It's pretty much what it sounds like, except we're going to be looking at this from a visual way, of course. That's what we do in art. We look at things visually. Visual weight refers to an apparent heaviness or lightness of forms arranged in the composition. The word apparent means you feel like that's what you see. Doesn't mean that one part of the painting physically feels heavier, like it is heavier weight-wise. It's just how it looks. And the second part of that is second bullet. When visual weight is equally distributed on either side of the implied or kind of imagined center of gravity, a composition is felt to be very visually balanced. So one of those bullets is your definition of visual weight, and the other one is how you can see it happening in a work of art. So the first image I'm going to show you is a statue or a sculpture. You can see it's out on the entryway of a building for something, and it's a giant red cube. As you can see, it's just what it looks like. It's standing three-dimensionally in space. It does have a hollow center. That's what you see is the round thing in the middle. You can like look up and into it. So this thing is actually not just like a painting of something balanced, but it is like physically looking balanced when you see it in person. All of the structure of the thing is setting on that one corner of this red sculpture. Those things in the background are like big windows. I don't know if you can see that very well. There's like drapes in the windows. So those would be pretty tall. That would be like a whole floor right there. So picture a person standing next to this thing. They would be pretty, it's pretty big sculpture is what I'm getting at. I would say a person standing there is probably like this tall. So just imagine yourself standing there trying to take this thing in and feeling like, oh, is it going to tip over? But of course it's not going to, hopefully, if they made it well. But this is an example of like really seeing balance in real life, like actually looking at it and feeling like it's just teetering on the axis of its central point. Can you see that? The central axis is like right through here. It's like halfway either way. So that would be like, even though it's not actually balancing, the artist has secured it to the ground. Certainly, it gives you that tension of that it's balancing. So that's kind of cool. It's kind of a cool example of balance because it's 3D. So in this idea of balance, we have 3 types. And you can either copy these definitions down, and I say this with everything in this course. You can copy them down word for word, but if you can write it in a way that does make sense to you a little better, that's probably better for your learning. You just want to make sure you do understand it and you're getting an accurate definition. We have symmetrical balance, approximate balance, and asymmetrical balance. What is symmetrical balance? Well, true symmetrical balance would be an exact mirror image of shapes and forms on either side of an imaginary axial dividing line. You can think about when little kids will fold a piece of paper in half and cut out like a butterfly or something and then open it back up, or a heart. Maybe you did that when you were little for Valentine's Day. You fold a piece of paper in half, cut out half a heart, and then open it up, and it has that fold right down the middle, but the 2 sides are identical, right? That would be true symmetrical balance. You don't see just so true symmetrical balance a ton in art. Sometimes more in modern contemporary art you see it. More times than not, we see these other 2 styles of approximate and asymmetrical. So to finish my definition there, mirror image on either side of this imaginary axial dividing line. The elements correspond to one another in size, shape, and placement. And when it says elements, like picture the butterfly again or the heart, the 2 shapes on either side, those 2 pieces, they correspond exactly in size, shape, and placement if it's true symmetrical balance. Then we have approximate symmetry, which you will see this quite a bit in art because oftentimes the artist is going for a real symmetrical look, but it's not important to them to just make it perfect symmetry. not a mirror image. So there will be slight differences between axle areas of a work of art, and I'll show you an example of that. And then asymmetrical balance is when the two sides that do not correspond to one another in size, shape, and placement. They are just purposefully different. And we'll look at several examples of that too. All right, this is our first example, and this one could be argued. Some people would say this is an example of symmetry, true symmetry, because it is very similar on both sides. If you folded it in half, you're going to have a lot of shapes matching up pretty perfectly. For instance, if you folded it in half, this circle, whoa, hard to draw a circle with a mouse. This circle are going to fold along this central axis. Whoa, hard to draw a line too. They're going to fold together, and those are going to come right together. So they would be symmetrical. And this shape here and this shape, those would fold together on this central line. And they too, why can't I draw a straight line? They too would be symmetrical. So the main parts of this are symmetrical. The main shapes, this thing and this thing, they would line up. However, if you start to look closer, look at the details. Let me erase that stuff. Look at the details, like right here. These things along that red line right here, and these things along this red line, they're not exactly the same, are they? Or even if you look at the colors, like this color is different from this color. So if you were to fold it in half, they're not going to line up totally symmetrical. Even though this circle is symmetrical to this circle, what's in them is different, slightly. Or are they the same? They actually might be the same, they're just different colors. Yeah, I think they are the same. So anyway, it's very close, but it's not identical. So that's just an example of approximate symmetry, though again, this one's kind of on the border. It could be close to calling it symmetrical. It's also an example of radial symmetry, which is not one of your words that I had you write down, but radial symmetry comes out from a center. It has like repetition and symmetrical balance as it comes out from the center. And so this one's kind of like that. This is the art of a mandala, which mandalas are a form of radial symmetry. Okay, so continuing on with balance, this one has a lot of information for you to write down. None of it's hard, you kind of have to think about it. So first of all, the principles of asymmetrical balance, not to be confused with that balance itself is a principle of design, but these are just, maybe a better word would be the characteristics of asymmetrical balance, or the types of asymmetrical balance. So this first one, they correlate. When I read this bullet right here, you can look at this example, and I'll put a little arrow. A large form is visually heavier than a smaller form. So you get asymmetrical balance. If you were drawing a picture, if this was your picture plane, and you drew a great big person, and then you drew a little bitty small person, it's not balanced, is it? It's definitely not symmetry. It's heavier on one side than the other. I'm going to use that a lot. Visually heavier. Do you see that? Look at this one. You have a dark valued form. I'm reading the second note. A dark valued form is visually heavier than a lighter valued form of the same size. Just a fact, just the way it is when we look at something. It's going to feel heavier, even though they're the same size. The darker one's going to feel heavier. And same thing with size. The larger one is going to feel heavier. This could be, picture this, I'm going back to number 1, just real quick, I have an example. Picture this if this were a drawing of a feather and a barbell that you lift weights with. The feather, we know, weighs nothing. The barbell weighs 20, 30, 40 pounds. Even though it's smaller, and we draw this feather great big, doesn't matter what it is it? It's how visually it feels. It's how much space it's taking up. But then that happens when you use darks and lights. The darker shape is going to feel heavier than the lighter shape. And it's not just black or white, it's darker. A dark purple elephant is going to feel heavier in a picture than a white elephant. Okay, the next bullet says a textured form is visually heavier than a smooth form of the same size, even if they're the same size. Can you see that happening in that little sample? All that busyness, all that texture makes it feel heavier. A complex form is visually heavier than a simple form of the same size. Details make something feel heavier. More intricate, more complicated, looks heavier. Two or more small forms can balance a larger one. So both of these are little in comparison to this guy, but when you put them together, that's a way to visually balance. And then lastly, a smaller dark form can balance a lighter one. So even though it's smaller, you have a picture of something that is really dark, like a very deep blue object in your picture. Maybe you're painting a still life and you have a really small, dark grape on the table. And next to it, you have a very large, something that's very light colored in the still life, like a cup that's sitting there, and it's white and it's light colored. It's bigger than the really dark grape, but they actually would feel slightly balanced because the weight of that dark one is going to weigh visually equal to the large white one. And hopefully you can see that happening in these simplified versions of those. But this could be, I tried to say a couple of examples of how you could picture that in a work of art, because that's what happens in art. We look for things like that. Is it balanced? And if it feels balanced, why does it feel balanced? Or if it doesn't feel balanced, why does that not feel balanced? So it's just interesting to think about, and hopefully you'll start to see those in these examples. So the next one, giving you just a second to get those written down. The next one is, this is Joseph Mallord William Turner's The Burning of the Houses of Parliament, 1835. And this is an example of asymmetrical balance, where it's not the same on both sides. I want you to take a moment and study this and see if you can figure out why it still feels balanced, still feels okay weight-wise, even though it's so different on one side versus the other. So we need to go back into thinking of in terms of the elements of art to help us analyze this. Look at the shape, first of all. What shapes or forms, three-dimensional forms or 2D shapes, do you see on the right side versus what you see on the left side? I think we'd all agree on the right side, which would be my right, this right, you see a very definite form, don't you? You see this bridge thing. It's a very, very definite structure. Undoubtedly, you know what that is. It's a solid rock stone structure. So we have a form here, a three-dimensional form. Where over here, we have some water and we have fire and a little bit of building structure we can see and some smoke, lots of smoke and fire going up. But we don't have anything solid and that actually would waste anything, like the same as a building. So shape and form wise, we have a lot more weight on this side. We have huge stone building. Over here, emptiness, other than the water and the fire. So you can talk about how that's very asymmetrical in shape and form. But does it feel balanced to you? Does it feel like the visual weight is okay between the two sides, like pretty balanced? Most people would probably say yes. And if you're not sure at this point, that's okay. Just hang with me because hopefully you'll start to see more as we look at things, how balance works. Do you remember what I said about color when you have warm and cool colors? Warm colors have some characteristics in a work of art that they do. They typically feel like they come forward at you. So, and cool colors typically feel like they recede, like they go back. It's not like you know this, it's not like you feel like this is right in front of you, but just visually it feels like it's sticking out more, like it's catching your attention more. It's getting, it's just coming forward. I don't know how else to describe that. And so, that is one way. If you look at the sky, just the sky region, this side feels like it's kind of pushing back or just disappearing, less emphasized. Where this side is just like bold and bright and eye-catching and vibrant and excitement and action is happening there. All that's probably feeling that way because of those colors that are being used there, the warm colors. So, also temperature-wise, right? For one thing, it's actually fire, so we know it's hot, but temperature-wise, you can really feel in this one the difference between warm and cool. So somehow, the way the artist did that, it's almost like this warm, and I'm including down here in the water, the reflection of the warm colors. All of this, because it's so warm, is feeling heavier than over here, what's kind of cool and receding back. But because of that, it's sort of balancing out all this mass right here. Even though space-wise, or I should not space-wise, even though shape and form-wise, there's a lot more on the right than there is on the left. The color of the fire makes it feel like there's a lot, still a lot on that side, even though there's no building. It feels like a lot. So that's a way, it's obviously different on both sides. It is not symmetrical, it's asymmetrical, but can you see how by the use of color, it still feels balanced? It still feels like the visual weight is somewhat the same and it doesn't make us feel like we're tipping over necessarily. So we really talked about balance, the principle of balance in this painting, just to kind of repeat it again, through the two elements of shape and mass and color. So this was our last picture for balance, but do know that as we look at all kinds of different works through the rest of the semester, we want to keep on thinking about balance. And now that you know what balance is, that there can be different types, that artists use different methods to still make it feel balanced even though it's asymmetrical, I hope you'll be able to see that, and I'll try to bring it up as we talk through different works of art. Our next principle of design is emphasis. Emphasis is, you may have learned it as a focal point. A lot of times that term is used in art classes. or talking about art, or really lots of things. Like, what was the focal point of that? Or you walk into some kind of a ceremony or something, and what's the focal point? That's the part where everybody wants your attention to go. Go to a birthday party. The focal point of the party is where the cake is. Like there might be balloons and a cake and plates on the table and ice cream. So that's kind of like the focal point. So it can translate through different types of things in life. But in art, focal point, emphasis, really the same thing. Subordination is kind of like the thing that makes the emphasis stand out. So back to my birthday party analogy, you go into a kid's birthday party, the cake and the balloons are all on the table. That's where the focus of the party is. And maybe everything around is not decorated because that's de-emphasized. It's subordinated. It's not important. The rest of the house is not as interesting. It's not the place where you're trying to get your attention for the fun and excitement to be. Well, in a painting or a work of art, or not just a painting, it could be three-dimensional as well. Artists generally, and a lot of times, want the viewer's attention to go to one specific place in the painting, in the work of art, and de-emphasize the other areas. So this is using the concepts of emphasis and subordination. They're kind of opposites, aren't they? If you're emphasizing one area, you're probably de-emphasizing the rest of the area. And then again, focal point, think of it, hear the word point in it? That's like one spot. It's like the real specific spot where you want the attention to go. This one's usually pretty easy for people to pick out. And again, we're going to be looking at how the artist uses the elements of art: line, color, texture, shape, space, form, value. How are they using those things to direct our attention to an emphasized area? Here's a couple examples that show pretty good emphasis and subordination. The first one is Francisco de Goya's execution of the 3rd of May. He felt very passionately about this atrocity on Spain and the French soldiers attacking the Spanish in this scene. But aside from the storyline of what's going on and the meaning behind it so much, let's look at this thing in terms of emphasis. What do you think that the artist is trying to emphasize in this painting? Hopefully you said that one man with his arms in the air wearing the white shirt and kind of yellowish pants. That's, if you look at it very long, that's most likely where most people's eyes are going to go to. And now I want you to look at thinking in terms of the elements of art. Just pick one of them. Pick any element and see if you can figure out how the artist de Goya is pushing our eyes to that man with the white shirt on. I'll use the element of light and value for this one since I haven't talked about that one yet. Look at the sky, very dark, right? It's nighttime, obviously. Look at kind of around the figures. Here, dark. Back here on this hill, obviously it's dark back there. It's kind of dark down here where these poor dead men are laying. So what do you see that's different here with light and value? We have a light source right here. And the light source is shining light, obviously, towards the sky. And so this is the brightest part of the picture, right here is much brighter than any other part. Yeah, we have little pops of light here and there, but the artist has very specifically created like a focal point or a point of emphasis by using light to illuminate this man and his face. I'm going to look at that. We can see this man's face, but most of the people, we don't see their faces. Most of the people are either hidden, the soldiers are hidden, or they're looking down, or they have their faces covered. But that guy is looking straight at the soldiers, and we see his face, and we see the kind of sad look on his face. Which wasn't a discussion of light. That was just a side discussion when I talked about his face. So light is very clearly being used in this one as emphasis. Hopefully you can see that. See that line on the ground right there? How the light's creating this sort of almost like a space right here, directing our eyes. I have to point out the element he's also using, which is line, because it's just so clear. The gun line is like one of those visual cues making our eyes go in that direction. Remember when we called that implied line? Like, what is he pointing at? What are those guns pointing at? They're pointed right at that poor man. So that's directing our eyes to go that way. There are other things you can discuss in this, other elements you could use to talk about emphasis, but I think those are some of the stronger ones. And then the other one here, we can talk about emphasis and subordination. Remember, subordination is where we de-emphasize things to bring the focus and attention to what we want the focus on. What are you trying to emphasize? You could look at this one and say that I put some top points down on this page. Size and placement. Where are the two figures in this picture? Kind of right smack in the middle, aren't they? You have some directional lines pointing to the people, particularly this, kind of like we did in this one, but we have this banjo, the arm of the banjo, it brings us out here. We might catch the side of that out there, and then it just brings our attention down here to the heart of the relationship between these two guys. So that kind of brings us to the focal point. What do you think the focal point is in this one? In this painting? To me, it feels like either right, I don't know, it could be right here. Like the playing, maybe, is the focal point. When the little boy and his grandpa their gaze is looking towards that. And this line brings us towards it. So I'm talking about line right now and how the lines all bring us towards that spot. Another way that thing you have going here is value, just like in De Goya's 3rd of May painting. This one, the banjo lesson, you have value, contrast and value. Look at the darks and lights. It's kind of funny because really the lighter areas are around the figures, aren't they? Do you see that? And even over here, it's lighter on this side. It's lighter. There's some light over here. And that light doesn't really draw our attention to it. It actually emphasizes the dark figures in the center. Even though there's a little more shadow on the figures, they are more emphasized because they're darker and here we go again, figure, ground, right? This is the ground. It's lighter in general. So that emphasizes them. You also see, as it says on your screen, that the background or the ground, the negative space, right, is kind of washed out. There's stuff there, and there's even texture in the background, but it doesn't feel as tight and detailed as like the faces on these two and the hands. And it's kind of real pale and light. It's almost like atmospheric perspective, sort of fading off into the distance. So perhaps we would all agree that the figures are the emphasized thing in that picture. The boy and his, I assume, grandpa. And then maybe the focal point is even right at the little boy's hand on the banjo. And we've discussed using light and value, line, and then like space, where it's fuzzier in the distance around the negative space is fuzzier and lighter, where the positive space is more detailed and clearer. Okay, so there we go. That's how we emphasize, or we talk about emphasis and subordination. Emphasis being the main principle of design. Next we have scale and proportion. I said this on the very first slide. Scale and proportion sort of go together, yet they're very different. Scale and proportion do both have to do with the size of an object, the size things are. So I hope you can make a distinction in your mind between these two. So scale means size in relation to a constant or normal size. I always think of this like with toy cars. There's different scales you can get, like 1/64th and 1/16th. I don't know what they are, but there's different scales like that because the car, the little toy car, the little Hot Wheels, has been scaled so far down, it's just a 64th of a real car. But in relation to itself, if it's done well, the rear view mirrors are still the right size compared to the car. The tires aren't huge in comparison to the car. They're correct. They're accurate in comparison to the size of the car. So that's scale. It's still okay in relation to itself. It's just either a much bigger or much smaller version of the real thing, normal size. Proportion refers to relationships between parts of a whole. In other words, the car, take the car analogy again, you take a real car and you scale it way down to a toy Hot Wheels car. But imagine that toy Hot Wheels car and one of the rear view mirrors, one of the side mirrors, is like huge. It's like the size of a baseball on this little bitty Hot Wheels. Well, that mirror is not in proportion. Does that make sense? So it's the relationship between two parts of a whole. And so we can look at this in art too, of course. And the first example I give you is Claes Oldenburg's Plantor, which is a garden spade, as you can probably see. And all of Claes Oldenburg's sculptures are this idea of taking an ordinary object and making it way out of scale. So usually taking something that's just an ordinary everyday object and making it really big. He's done this with French fries, a badminton birdie is at the Kansas City Art Museum, and it's just this huge sculpture sitting out in the grass by the Kansas City Art Museum of a badminton birdie. You know those little things with the red thing at the end, and you hit them with badmintons, and it's just like abnormally, it's ridiculously big. He's done it with things like lipstick. Like you'll walk in the art gallery and there'll be this humongous lipstick tube sitting as if it's a piece of artwork in the middle of the floor, like 8 feet tall. So he is definitely playing around with scale. He's, as we'll learn about later, is what we call a pop artist. And pop artists oftentimes play around with the idea of ordinary objects becoming high art. And then we have this other work of art here, and I don't have his name. I cannot remember his name, but he's a famous ceramicist artist and did many, many sculptures like this one, similar. They are self-portraits of himself, and he kind of plays around with dimensions and proportions and things. So this would be an example where it's out of proportion. Do you see that? His ear is a little big, don't you think, for his body? I think it's just supposed to be his neck and like shoulders, collar, shoulders thing. It's not his whole body. It's supposed to be like almost like a bust that you would see in an art museum, where it's just the shoulders of the person and then their head. But he clearly has made himself silly and made this humongous ear. So that's an example. The ear is very much out of proportion, isn't it, when you relate it to the whole? Another aspect of scale and proportion is this thing in art we call hierarchical scale. And that's where we use size to, the change in size to indicate the importance of something. I've actually mentioned this before. I believe we were talking about Egyptian art. There was another type of art we were talking about where the king or the queen or the pharaoh is depicted really large, and then the servants or the lower class people are depicted small. And so that's just a way historically cultures have depicted size. But the scale is wrong, right? People aren't really that much different in size. We're different heights, but we're not like a completely different scale usually. So this is an example of that. And the guy at the top here, this would represent the king of this culture. And he is not just abnormally huge, but if you look at his head, it is quite a bit bigger than his servants here on the sides. And his head is like not in proportion to his body. His body is, his head is like 2/3 of his body. Well, in a real person, proportion-wise, our heads aren't that big at all. We're mostly the rest of our bodies. Our heads are very small in comparison. So this is an example of just looking at the king here himself. The size, the size of his head shows that in relation to his body is out of what? Proportion or scale? Out of proportion, because nobody's head is this big in relation to their body. So he is not made in proportion, probably intentionally though. That's part of hierarchical scale, is the king, who's thought to be amazing and this wonderful leader, and you respect and you honor and you glorify, he's going to have a really big head because he's important. His head is like the crown of the body, right? So that's probably intentional. But then in addition to his body being out of proportion, he is bigger in scale than the people next to him. And down here, I don't know if this is another rendering of the king or just another important person, but if you look at this guy compared to these guys, he's a lot bigger, isn't he? And maybe these are children, I don't know. But even in this case, you can see his head is enormous compared to these guys. And in this, funny, the title of this thing is Royal Altar to the Hand. And these are hands down here. Do you see them? And those two are out of, they're not in the correct scale. They're really big compared to, well, I guess I should say proportion in that case, because we're looking at this in relation to this whole thing, right? So it's kind of like you want to find somebody in this thing to base all the other people off of. Let's say this guy right here is what we base everything off of. If he is true to size, if he's accurate, then either this is a child or he's really small and not important. The king's head is huge. This king's head is huge. And these hands are huge. But since it's an altar to the hand, perhaps that's the point of it. They want to emphasize, there's another word, emphasize, by making them bigger, that's important. So I guess we need to think about what element are we talking about when we're analyzing this. When we're talking about scale and proportion, what element are we talking about? We're talking about, we could say shapes, but more accurately forms, because these are three-dimensional forms, aren't they? And when we compare three-dimensional forms, they're not correct in scale. So that is what hierarchical scale means. All right. We have one more principle of design to discuss today, and that is rhythm. I have to admit, rhythm is always the hardest one for me to really see well in a work of art, but when I put my mind to it, I can. So rhythm is kind of what you think with music rhythm. Think about music you listen to. Music has a rhythm, right? It has a beat. What is that beat? It's repeated through the song. It can change, but there is some definite point of repetition to this beat that goes through a song, and that in turn creates rhythm. In art, it's very similar. It's like you are seeing a beat that goes through the work of art. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. Sometimes there's almost like a direct correlation between the work of art looks almost like music. Sometimes you can see that. So this is an important word right here, though, repetition. You really can't have rhythm. You can't have, I should say, visual rhythm if you don't have repetition. They really go side by side. They really are important together. So I'm going to show you a video in a little bit of just a YouTube video that goes through all the visual principles of design again. And in that video, they actually separate these two as if they are two separate principles of design, rhythm and repetition. So don't be confused by that. Like I said, they vary a little bit depending on the source. But I really think of it like rhythm is the main thing you're seeing, the principle of design. It's being done through the repetition of an element. Like it could be shapes repeated. It could be lines repeated. It could be colors repeated, textures repeated. And when you have that repetition, you get rhythm. So let me I have a cluster of works here that we'll kind of go through a little at a time. Let me move this around just a bit so you can see the full thing. So looking at this top one, you can see you've got there's figures of women in there, but you have these big, bold swirls of, I would definitely call those lines, wouldn't you? They almost look like a brushstroke. It's just this huge swipe of the brushstroke of these different colors. So there's all kinds of elements happening here. We got lines, we've got colors. You could say there's a pattern there, a pattern of lines that keeps going and going and going. This is where pattern sort of gets lumped into the thing too. We talked about pattern as an element of art, and I really think that it is, but sometimes it can be talked about as a principle of design because, and it goes along with repetition too. You almost have like this green line, this red line, this blue line. And so there's like a pattern happening. It doesn't repeat very good, but there's another red line, there's another green line, they're all throughout, like repeating it. So it's like pattern and repetition get mushed together in this one. But I hope you can see with the repetition of these lines, the repetition of colors, that it does become like almost like a musical beat that happens through it. And I think with the color on this one, thinking in terms of the element of color, do you see how maybe the darker ones, it's almost like these dark blue ones get an intense pop of more of a beat. And then it kind of fades out to the light yellow and the light green. And then maybe you get another dark, intense pop of the dark blue. Or maybe you're seeing the red as the more intense ones. Because we have warm and cool colors happening, don't we? And maybe the fingers on these women like kind of point down. And so that repetition of those lines of their fingers sort of creates like a rhythm also. Looking at this one over here, this work is by Donald Judd, and he is this sculpture here on the wall. He was known as a minimalist sculptor, 1970s, which we'll look more at this genre of art later, but it's very simplified down to just very basic forms and shapes. As you can see, these are just like wooden boxes almost that are mounted to the wall. Perfectly shaped, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly mounted to the wall, straight, you know, the angles are just very straight and square. But do you see the repetition? Repeating the same exact form over and over and over as it moves up and down the wall. Same exact form, right? A 3D box, basically, is the form. And so that repetition creates a little sense of rhythm when we look at that. It's almost like a boom, 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 boom as you look at that. And then your eyes can do things like looking at the space between the boxes. That almost becomes like a rhythm. What are the colors that we see through there? So there's a lot of visual interest too. But that's an example of shape, form, even color, repeating to create rhythm. Color by this is wood, right? It's kind of a similar color on each one of those.